I came to the floor today to join so many of my colleagues in expressing my opposition to Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to serve as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. As the highest court in the land, the justices on the Supreme Court are tasked with the enormous responsibility of interpreting and protecting the fundamental constitutional rights that are guaranteed to all Americans. Its decisions are not abstract legal principles that are reserved for a few. Its decisions affect the rights of all of us. They touch on issues that affect all of our daily lives, from the health care we receive, to the person we can marry, to the air that we breathe. These are significant stakes that we face when considering any nomination to serve on the Supreme Court. Now, weeks ago, I announced my opposition to Judge Kavanaugh's nomination based on concerns that I had with his record. And even though, as Senator Markey pointed out so eloquently, we haven't gotten to see a lot of that record, we have enough to know that I have very serious concerns about Judge Kavanaugh. I want to talk about a couple of those, highlight three, actually, concerns. First is his opposition to the Affordable Care Act. No, I believe all Americans in this country, everyone in this country, should have access to health care that they can afford so they don't have to worry when they need to take their kids to the doctor, so that they don't have to worry about being bankrupt because they can't afford the costs, about having to worry if they get a serious illness. And yet, Judge Kavanaugh dissented in a decision to uphold the Affordable Care Act. And as the result of that decision, he puts critical protections for millions of Americans with pre-existing conditions at risk. And it's particularly concerning now when we know there is a court case in Texas that the government of the United States has declined to continue to defend, that puts at risk the requirement that insurance companies cover those with pre-existing conditions. And, you know, you can talk about trying to Band-Aid over that every way you want. The fact is, unless we have a real health care program as we have under the Affordable Care Act, insurance companies are not going to cover people with pre-existing conditions, and they're going to charge you more if they do cover you. Second, I'm very concerned about his opposition to women's reproductive rights. Judge Kavanaugh has praised Justice Rehnquist's dissent in the landmark Roe v. Wade decision that guarantees women the right to make their own reproductive health decisions. I believe that's one of the most basic and fundamental rights that we have, not just as women, but that families have. Now, women should be able to make that decision in consultation with their families, with their physicians, with their religious beliefs, and this should not be something that the government dictates, and yet Brett Kavanaugh suggests that that fundamental basic right is up for consideration. Now, finally, I have a serious concern about Judge Kavanaugh's view of executive branch power that could place the president above the law. Judge Kavanaugh has said that sitting presidents can't be indicted, can't be prosecuted, and should have the authority to fire a special counsel at will. Well, with the Mueller investigation, with so many concerns that have been raised about this president's manipulation of laws that have allowed him to enrich himself and his company, that suggests that where he has been suggesting that he may fire the Attorney General because he's not willing to do his bidding at the Justice Department. I just don't see how we can put somebody on the Supreme Court who thinks that the president is above the law. You know, as I learned American history and our Constitution and our values and principles, I believe that nobody is above the law in our democracy, including the President of the United States. And I think we need a Supreme Court justice who believes the same thing. And yet what we've heard from Judge Kavanaugh suggests that he thinks the president is above the law. Now, at the time I announced my opposition to the nominee, we had not heard the allegations of sexual assault against Judge Kavanaugh. In the weeks since those have come out, this Senate, this country, have been rocked by those allegations. I was one of the many millions of Americans throughout the country who tuned in to closely watch that hearing when Christine Blasey Ford shared her story. Her testimony in front of the Judiciary Committee was sincere and credible, and I believe her. The impact of Dr. Ford's testimony is very telling about the pervasiveness of sexual violence in our culture. The allegations made by Christine Ford and others were serious and trustworthy, and I believe they should have been thoroughly and impartially investigated, and they were not. But on the positive side, Dr. Ford's bravery has given so many women in this country the courage to tell their stories. She gave others courage, and we have seen an outpouring from survivors who now feel like they too can come forward. Senator Markey talked about the number of people that he's heard from in his office, and I've heard that same story time and again from so many of my colleagues. We're certainly seeing this in New Hampshire. The Sexual Harassment and Rape Prevention Program, which is also called SHARP, a program at the University of New Hampshire that provides services and support to sexual assault survivors. They've reported an increase in people reaching out for help. And I've heard that from crisis centers across the Granite State, who fielded an influx of calls from survivors who can relate to Dr. Ford's testimony and who feel compelled to speak out. On Tuesday, I spoke with the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, which told me they've seen similar interactions with survivors who are now stepping forward, women and men whose trauma of past sexual assaults has been revived by Christine Ford's testimony. Like my colleagues, I've received letters from sexual assault survivors who've been deeply affected by Dr. Ford's testimony and whose courage has given them the strength to share their own stories. What's been amazing to me as I read them, what I've heard from people who have contacted our office, is that some of them are in their 70s and 80s, and they reveal decades-old sexual assaults for the very first time. These wounds are real. The wounds are raw, and it is incumbent on all of us in this body, regardless of where you stand on Brett Kavanaugh. It's incumbent on all of us to not deepen those scars by diminishing the pain of these women as political theater. This is not political theater, and it should not be viewed through a partisan lens. In those emotional emails and calls and letters from dozens of women and a few men, I think sometimes we forget that sexual assault doesn't just happen to women, it happens to men. They have described their sexual assaults and how they have been affected by the events of Christine Ford's testimony and the hearing with Judge Kavanaugh. In so many of those letters and emails, they talk about the details of what they experienced in those sexual assaults, how it affected them, how it's affected their lives. The fact that in most cases they didn't tell anybody because they didn't feel like they would be believed, or they thought they would be demeaned, or they thought it was their fault. But what's been interesting to me as part of those letters and emails has been that so many of the people we've heard from have not just told their personal stories, but they have expressed their concerns about the country as part of writing in. Concerns that we're so divided, that we're so angry, that we're so uncivil to one another. And sadly, they're right, based on what they've seen over the last couple of weeks. We've seen that at political rallies over the past few years, and we've seen it in this building. And we must do better. The disunity that we model here is hurting the country. The scorched earth politics that have been practiced here are deepening our divides. Now, I will oppose Judge Kavanaugh's nomination, and I continue to hope that something may happen at the 11th hour. I know that's not likely. But I also will encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to think about this moment, to reflect on our obligations to the American people, to the United States Senate, and to considering future Supreme Court nominees. As so many people have said, this process has undermined the faith of the American people in the ability of the Supreme Court to be an objective arbiter of cases that come before them. This process has inflamed existing divides within our country and within Congress, and we can't let this become the status quo. As an institution, as a legislative body, we must be better than this. Now, I've always been told that when we're standing at the edge of an abyss, the best step is always backwards. So I hope all of us can take a step back. I hope we can take a step back when we're past this nomination, that we can return to more civil discourse. I hope that we can better try to understand each other's point of view, and that we can see each other's humanity. And I hope we can be better stewards of our democracy, because this country demands it. Thank you, Madam President.